Good evening and welcome back to the podcast, Everyday Man of God. Well, you can tell that, I guess, by just looking at the title of the podcast as you clicked on. So, I guess I didn't have to introduce it. I'm Steve, as most of you know, Stephen LeBlanc. I'm thankful and grateful, as always, that you've tuned in this evening. I did this podcast on Rumble last night. I was not able to upload this podcast as I'm going to be redoing it tonight to be able to connect it to Spotify and YouTube. So I apologize for those of you on Rumble that was not able to click over here, and those of you who didn't even know it was on Rumble. Um, it's unfortunate, but as I was saying before, I in the middle of turning this shed into a podcast studio and been working on that, so hopefully I'm able to get that done as soon as possible. So if you hear some background noise or any kind of echoing, that's because I'm still working on this. So, all right, I don't want to go on and on, I guess, over that, but I just wanted to let everybody know that we'll get this thing up and running. And those of you who knew that I did not have a cord and it was waiting on the tower, I did get the tower system in. It is fixed. I'm just working on a few little other kinks in the system. Well, let's get to it. Tonight we're going to be talking about the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the Vatican, and ESG. ESG I was going to save for a separate podcast, but I'm going to talk about it tonight. And I'll briefly talk about the United Nations, but the next podcast we're going to get really deeper into the United Nations. Now, there is something called the Bretton Woods Conference, and that was in 1944. There, again, that's another thing we'll have a podcast coming up on. I gotta stop saying we'll have a podcast on and just make one giant podcast, I guess. But that was in 1944. And while it was formed in 1944, I should say, I believe it was 1945, December 27th. 1945. But we're going to start with the IMF, International Monetary Fund. I know the title says the Vatican. In today's world, or recently, everybody wants to blame the Roman Catholics or the Jews for all the problems in the world. And that's fine if you want to assume those things. You have the free will to make that decision and choice to go in that direction. But quite often, I don't see any proofs of things. People just talk about it on the surface, but don't go anywhere else after that. But I am going to point out how the Vatican is behind a lot of things that you didn't realize. So it's actually not a conspiracy at that point. I've said before, when too many things happen, it's no longer a coincidence. It's just, sorry, when too many roads lead to Rome, we got an issue. It all goes back to that, and even further back in going to the Gomer and the end times and the European Union, of which we'll talk about down the road. So the IMF is an international monetary fund I was talking about earlier. It's a financial agency of the United States nations. It is a financial agency of the United Nations. Where does that money come from? See, that's been founded ever since 1945. My argument is going to simply be that the New World Order, the last push, the final stage, went into place. And some will say, oh, no, it's finally going into place now. No. The road work, the structure, the infrastructure of the NWO, the New World Order, not that wrestling organization that apparently was out in the 1990s or something like that. I'm not talking about that. Somebody just goes, isn't that a wrestling organization? That's not what I'm referring to. I just killed a bee. I don't know how that bee just came into here out of nowhere, but whew, that was a close one. Somebody's going to get mad at me now. But again, this organization, the United Nations, the financial agency, the International Monetary Fund, Bretton Woods Conference was in 1944. It was actually started in 1944, but went into full play December 27th, 1945. Now, that conference was originally held in July of 1945. The World Bank Group came from this conference as well. And this World Bank Group is why we have all these other organizations. The World Bank Group is the parent organization of the International Finance Corporation, which was in 1956. Robert Lejourner, first CEO, interestingly went on to be the first president of the Japan Fund. That's a little interesting, don't you think? The International Development Association was in 1960, and that was under Eugene R. Black Sr. He was the president of the World Bank. The president of the World Bank. Why is this man important? Why is it important and sad and predictable and people at play here? Because his father was a chairman of the Federal Reserve. Gee, big shocker. Some may know, I think I've talked about this previously, about the Jekyll Island and so forth, and the secret meeting, and then it didn't really become secret. So the New World Order today, I'm going a little off here, but the New World Order and the Bilderbergs there, and all these organizations, the way they're now keeping secret is by not keeping secret. It's like keeping the secret out and open, just like the Jesuits doing the same thing. Well, we're not Jesuits. We're right here out in the open. What do you mean? Same thing. Same thing. And the International Center of Settlement of Invest Disputes, or I should say invested disputes, was in 1966. They sat as a tribunal. Have you heard that before? Tribunal came from the World War II. Yes, the word dates back further than that, but people who were involved in this were involved in that point in time too. They sat as a tribunal when the Indonesian government, I want you to pay attention to what I'm going to say here, because everybody's always thinking, oh, the government will win over a company. The government will always win. Well, the Indonesian government was sued by a company called Churchill Mining. The company won. Occidental Petroleum, who went into OPEC, which was run by Al Gore Jr.'s father, Al Gore Sr., where do you think he got the money? Mr. Greenpeace there, whatever you want to call himself. I forget what he did to climate. Oh boy, I'm trying to think of that now. I cannot. The inconvenient truth, or the inconvenient truth. He's all about saving the planet. His fortune was built on oil. So the Occidental Petroleum sued the government of Ecuador. Guess what? The government lost again. Then there's the Tullow and Philip Morris lawsuit. And they won against the government because they sued. See, these companies, if you look deeper into those particular companies, they actually have ties with the United Nations and the founders of the Bretton Woods Conference. See, everybody's in the pocket of somebody, huh? Let's take a look at a couple of the key founders of the IMF. Harry Dexter White was a U.S. Treasury Department guy. He was at the Bretton Woods Conference. Let's get into things that nobody's really talking about him. He was also accused of spying for the Soviets in 1948, not in 1960, years later. No, 1948, roughly 3 years after Bretton Woods Conference. And here's a nice side note. He died a couple of days after testifying and denying he was a communist. He actually died in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire is actually where the Bretton Woods Conference was held. Another interesting thing, I believe Fitzwilliam was named after a colonel. Someone could fact check me on that, that's okay. Was named after a colonel in one of the earlier wars. The Revolutionary War, I believe. Now, I'm okay with anybody going, no, actually it was the wrong war, because that's how I'm remembering, and I could be wrong on that one. But another side note, his wife was a Russian. He was also a Democrat. You know who appointed him to the IMF chair? Harry Truman. When did he appoint him? after he was advised that Harry Dexter White may be a spy and was under investigation, and he still let him run the IMF. Harry Truman is not Mr. Innocent. We all think of FDR as messing up the nation, which he did. Harry Truman was no ball of kindness, my friend. Now we go to John Maynard Keynes. And I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but it is what it is. An economist and philosopher. The latter, of course, being more dangerous than the first. He was part of what was called the Cambridge Apostles. They went on to produce the famous Cambridge Five. In fact, there's been films made about this. And why are they famous? They were Soviet spies in the 1930s. And he was part of this crew. You go, oh, listen, just because he knew them, he went to the same school, well, he was part of the same organization. And why is that important? Because it matters. Because of the pride. They're very known, they are known for having the pride of having an unbreakable bond. So if they pride themselves on an unbreakable bond, then it stands to reason he knew exactly that they were spies. He knew exactly what was going on when he was at IMF. And when he was accused of being a spy in 1948, I have no doubt that he was. Whether he was exonerated or not doesn't matter to me. Sometimes circumstantial evidence is evidence itself. Sometimes it's not, but in this case I think it is. Too many coincidences don't make sense to me. Too many things pointing to him being one. I don't think he was framed. I think people just knew. So all the Cambridge Apostles were a tight-knit community. They don't break apart. Now, I'm not going to get more into them. You can look that up. Maybe I'll put something together someday, but you can get into them and find out what they're all about. So John Maynard Keynes was also a bisexual for most of his life. Well, I shouldn't say most, but in his earlier life. He was very known to being illiterate, yeah. Those literacy Archie people over there in those little, communities and the poets and so forth. And he became a bisexual then. But later on, he had a wife. And they were married for a decent amount of time. Oh yeah, and guess what? His wife was also a Russian. That's another coincidence. Now remember, unbreakable bond with the Cambridge Apostles. All five of them went on to be convicted as spies in the 1930s. He was accused of being a spy also. Along with the other gentleman who co-founded the IMF, Harry Dexter White, was also accused of being a spy in 1948. Ooh, a lot of accusations going around. Both men were married to Russian women. Oh, that doesn't mean anything. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying a lot of coincidences. Oh, he was also an outspoken supporter for eugenics up and until his death in 1946. So he was backing eugenics for a long time. And we all know about Miss Margaret there with Planned Parenthood and how she purposely, well, she's a racist, she wanted to kill black babies. She was a racist. There's no doubting that. There's no, I'm trying to think of a better word. It's public record. There you go. It's public record. Get rid of the undesirables. And among those were the blacks. She was a Democrat. And she was known to support communism. Socialism. Go figure. So where will all the other governments get money from? Well, perhaps the IMF. Funneled from dirty money, inevitably. Inevitably. That's a great word I just made up. So The word actually is inevitably. 1945, as I mentioned before, in my opinion, is the end of what the past was. So at the end of the World War II, there would be no more world wars. Well, at least not by that name and not by that same manner as before. We kept on having wars. We called them something different. We fought them in proxies. We fought them through channels. It was never a direct on fight most of the time. Cloak and dagger sometimes. Cold War. Nothing really changed except how we're going to share the money among the elite and wealthy. So as I said before, in 1945 at the Bretton Woods Conference in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, in my opinion, is the beginning of the last stage of the infiltration and the selling of America. You have two accused Russians with possible sympathies towards Nazism at one point, which is strange to me, but they were mostly communist. And one was an anti-Semite, public record, with beliefs in New Age pagan philosophy. New Age pagan philosophy. Sounds like the Roman Catholic Church, doesn't it? All right, let's move on to the ESG factor of things. Now, that's become pretty popular as of recently. Everybody wants to talk about the ESG. There's a brand new thing called the ESG. Just came out of nowhere. Nothing ever comes from nowhere. It doesn't work that way. There was a groundwork laid. Whether it comes to fruition 10 years later, 50 years later, 70 years later, there's something put into play, and it's been put into play since 1940s. So the ESG, which is commonly, well, I should say not commonly known, but it's called the Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance. Basically, called environmental, social, and governance. I took the corporate out, by the way, even though the large corporations and government are sleeping in the same bed. The idea of ESG data is not new. The SDG, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, which was set in 2015, was a predecessor to that. So that came first. But here's the fun part. One can argue that they can go back to the International Development Association formed in 1960. Well, that doesn't seem new, does it? And what is their aim? This is 1960 now with the International Development Association. What is their aim? You might recognize one of the words. Well, equity, sustainability, and human development, of course. Is that word equity? Not a new thing, is it? There is nothing new under the sun. So the interesting thing about Sustainable Development Goals, they are only sustainable if everyone buys in or are forced to do so under perhaps legislation or corporate controlled rules. You know, the credit ratings that companies get for the ESG. You ever notice how the media leaves the corporate part out of the governance part? Pretty sneaky, huh? Oh, we're holding corporations accountable to governments. No, they're not. No, they're not. There are 17 goals in the SDG. I'm not going to name them all, but here are a few curious ones. No poverty, which is an impossible goal with governmental and corporate involvement. Sustainable cities, smart cities. Controlled government and corporations under government. Or how about the climate action? Oh, I thought that was new. No. Or today they call it what? Climate control now. Not climate act, climate control. As if we are gods and can control the climate. We are not God. How about peace, justice, and strong institutions? To whoever falls in line with whatever the dictator or whoever the dictator will be. There will be no peace. You cannot force peace among people. Justice, there'll always be injustice. And strong institutions, the breeding grounds of corruption, brainwashing, control. Let's go back a little further. The Millennium Development Goals, MDG, not MSG. The UN was involved with it all. Although, you know, I noticed the UN does love their acronyms, don't they? You can also go back to the what's the word? Copenhagen. You can go back to the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development. You can take a look at the ODI. That would be the Overseas Development Institute. That was back in the early 1960s. All of this, in my opinion, goes back to the Bretton Woods Conference after World War II, like I mentioned earlier. These were all created then. They're all just a continuation of that. And as I mentioned before, if you're in the Northeast, that happened up in your area. I used to be from the Northeast in New Hampshire. Well, not in New Hampshire, I was in Mass, but in New Hampshire in July 1944. The interesting thing about that, they formed it in 1944, right? And the expected defeat of Germany, there's no guarantee, sure, it looked like that was going to happen, and Japan. And they, as if it was, lock, stock, and barrel. Germany didn't surrender till May 1945. Japan didn't surrender until August 1945. But they were able to form this in July 1944. Well, that's a little curious to me. So again, for me, in my opinion, the popular ESG, IMF, World Bank, UN, or any of the UN agendas, SGs, or SDG rather, and others, are controlled. All were born in New Hampshire, July 1944. The goal, one world order. A new world order. The UN will control the forced unity of the world. The Vatican, going back to its original traditional ways, and I talked about sede vacantis and sede vacantism, with Mel Gibson now and Jim Caviezel, and I'm not saying his name out of disrespect. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I don't think I've ever heard his last name pronounced. The Vatican will go back to its original traditional ways. That will attempt to force unity, and that's what they did back then. There's no secret to that. So they're going to attempt to force unity of all the religions of the world to coexist, or you will not exist. Rome, Babylon, Egypt, it's all been done before, or at least attempted. And to paraphrase, like I did earlier, Ecclesiastes chapter 1:9, there is no new thing under the sun. Let me ask you this question. A lot of people saying, oh, we're going to kick back and we're going to stand up. Has any Christian stopped what has been written? No. Some fool themselves into believing that they have been successful in prolonging the inevitable. They have not. To think that is to erroneously put yourself at a level with God. And that, my friend, is a sin. You can't stop what's coming. So stop. It is not our job to change policy politically, economically, or morally. Our job is to spread the word of God and prepare for his return. The change we can play is to bring the gospel according to the Bible. And the morals, the stewardship of money, the Holy Spirit will bring them the ability to understand the truth by the words that are written in the Bible, not books about the Bible, or teachings and seminars and lectures and seminaries by men who fool themselves to believe they have an authority that they were never granted. Some men feel that they have been granted an authority by another man, by another man, by another man. They were not granted by God. That is a lie. You're going to find most of the corruption, 99% of this, I'm just throwing numbers on, are going to go back to the Vatican. I'm going to be a spoiler alert now. You're going to see that throughout this whole thing. The Roman Catholic Church and socialism. For some reason, those two have been coexisting together. I appreciate your time as always for listening to my podcast. I will forever be thankful and grateful whether 5 people listen or 505 people listen. I'm thankful for that. And I mean that sincerity. I mean that sincerely. God bless and good night.